When Silas Cy Booker handed over his old laminated ID, the courtroom chuckled like he'd just told a joke with no punchline. The laughter was quick, scattered, a few stifled behind polite hands, others bolder, bouncing off the high ceiling like marbles on tile. Cy didn't flinch. His weathered fingers, thick with time and grit, gently nudged the plastic card across the worn wooden bench. It caught the light curling slightly at the edges like it had grown tired of being believed. Judge Melba Grayson adjusted her glasses, leaned forward and squinted at the ID, her brow creased in the same way it had for 30 years, when the scales of law and common sense tugged in opposite directions. "Mr. Booker, this license expired in 1997, she said evenly, though the twitch at the corner of her mouth betrayed a mild wince. "I haven't had reason to renew it." "Your Honor," Cy replied, voice steady and low, like gravel rolling slow under tires. "Stopped driving long haul that same year." Randy Bloom, slick-suited and barely 30, let out a breathy chuckle and turned to the rows behind him with a knowing shrug. "Your Honor, the issue here isn't nostalgia, it's legal standing. The gentleman may have fond memories of his truckin' days, but the law requires proof of land ownership in current terms." The courtroom murmured again. One woman whispered, "Bless his heart," while another leaned in and asked, "Isn't he the one used to fix rigs out by Booker's Hollow?" Outside, the faint twang of a fiddle meandered from the county radio van parked by the courthouse steps. AM 640 was still airing. Veterans Day tributes, bluegrass. Salute the DJ called it. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee gone bitter from the burner and powdered creamer, dissolving reluctantly into styrofoam cups. Deputy Carl Jenkins stood by the door, arms crossed, shifting his weight with the impatience of a man who thought court was a waste of his Tuesday. His eyes rolled lazily toward the plaintiff's table. No one had asked him to speak, and that suited him fine. Cy opened the flap of his folder. The flap creaked faintly, like an old hinge. He withdrew a thin stack of papers, handwritten ledgers in his son's scrawl, dotted with miles, logged fuel stops, weather notes. Next came a folded freight log, edges cracked but still legible, marked with the name, Red Rock Freight East Division. A pause settled over the room, uncertain. Judge Grayson cleared her throat. "Do you have a recent title or survey map?" Mr. Booker Cy met her gaze, his eyes pale but unshaken. "No, ma'am. But that ledger shows we maintained the access path since '84, plowed it every winter. My boy Danny, he logged every trip," Randy scoffed. "Your Honor. With all due respect, we can't just take a man's word and a faded notebook." From the gallery, a snort, someone muttered. "Ain't that something, man works a land 40 years and still don't count." Kyle, the court. Intern sat hunched on a folding chair along the side wall, scribbling something in his notebook, though he hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. He'd smirked earlier when Cy had handed over the laminated ID, but now his pen had paused. Cy reached into his coat pocket, then hesitated. Slowly, he drew out a small brass keychain, dull with a tire-shaped charm and the faded logo of Red Rock. He laid it on top of the folder. "This was Danny's," Cy said quietly. "Gift from the dispatcher, his last year driving. We kept it in the ledger box." Judge Grayson's eyes lingered on the keychain, but her face revealed nothing. After a moment, she exhaled slowly and looked down at her docket in light of today's submissions. "The court will grant a 24-hour continuance. Mr. Booker, if you can produce more definitive documentation, by tomorrow we will revisit the matter. Otherwise, we will proceed to judgment." She tapped her gavel once, not sharply, but firmly enough to mark the end. The benches creaked again, as folks stood murmuring among themselves. Outside, the radio had shifted to a slow mandolin tune, something about lost roads and old names. Cy remained still for a moment, before gathering his papers into the folder. He coughed once quietly and covered it with the back of his hand, then took a tissue from his coat and wiped gently. Deputy Jenkins opened the door wide, the early November light slanting across the old tile floor. People filed out, boots and heels clapping unevenly as the room emptied. Kyle hesitated, still seated. He stared at the tire keychain now lying alone on the bench. Red Rock Freight, he murmured under his breath. The name scratched something faint and forgotten in the back of his mind. He frowned, head tilting, and for the first time that morning, he wasn't looking at Cy like a curiosity. As the room cleared, Kyle noticed the emblem on Cy's keychain. Red Rock Freight and frowns. Something about it catching his memory. At the edge of Booker's Hollow, a battered garage leaned like it was tired too, but it had held up longer than most friendships in town. Evening had a way of softening things in the hollow. The dying sun pushed gold through the hickories, spilling shadows across the gravel drive, and catching the faint glint of rust on the old garage roof. Inside, the familiar hiss of air and the smell of warm oil hung thick. Cy Booker hunched over a carburetor, his hands moving slow, methodical, like they had a rhythm older than muscle memory. The hum of AM radio drifted from the corner shelf, some bluegrass tune from the 70s, the kind that sounded like sorrow had learned to dance. He paused for a moment and wiped his palms on a rag. Stiff from age, the corner beam of the garage caught his eye, as it always did. His hand reached out, brushing against the grain, and found the carving beneath the grime. Dune BP 1993, 30 years. The wood had grayed, but the initials still held their place like they were waiting to be remembered. A breeze carried the scent of applewood smoke from someone's distant hearth. Cy's nose twitched, and he inhaled like a man pulling in a ghost. He didn't turn around when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He didn't need to. Only one car in town wheezed like that when it idled too long. "Mabel Creighton's old Buick, don't you ever lock this place?" she asked gently, stepping out with a pie tin wrapped in foil. She wore a cardigan that didn't quite match her skirt, and carried herself like someone who refused to acknowledge bad knees. "Ain't much worth stealing," Cy murmured, not looking up. She placed the pie on the workbench, moving a can of axle grease to make room. Pecan, the real kind, not the syrupy mess they sell at Quick Mart. Cy gave her a nod that meant more than words. He looked at the pie, then at her, then back to the carburetor. "You didn't have to, I know," she said simply, "but I did." He finally straightened up, stretching his back until it popped. "It's just a place," he said, more to the rafters than to her. "Folks got smaller battles than mine." Mabel looked around the garage. There were still grease-stained calendars on the walls, all frozen in different years. A cracked vinyl stool sat lopsided near the sink. The floor held the smell of decades motor oil tobacco, the stubborn weight of memory. "You've been saying that for 20 years, she replied, brushing sawdust from her sleeve. "Still haven't convinced me," he gave a short laugh, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. The AM radio buzzed again, something about trucker safety in winter, and Cy turned the knob down with his knuckle. The knock on the garage frame came next, light. Uncertain, Kyle stood in the doorway, a notebook under one arm, backpack slung haphazardly. His sneakers looked out of place against the oil-stained floor. "Hey," the boy said, trying to sound casual. "You mind if I'm doing a project for my civics class." "Oral histories, Sil." Eyed him, then the notebook. "Ain't much of a historian." "Still worth recording," Kyle said, stepping inside. Mabel looked at Cy, then gave Kyle a small nod before heading back to her car. "Save me a slice," she said over her shoulder. The garage quieted again. Kyle wandered near the wall where old patches and photographs hung frayed trucking jackets, a shelf with tiny model rigs, a faded photo of a young man grinning beside a Kenworth cab. The resemblance to Cy was unmistakable. "Your son?" Kyle asked, gesturing. Cy didn't look up from wiping his wrench. "Danny." He liked the road. "Red Rock Freight, huh?" Kyle ran a finger near the old logo, I think. I think I've heard my granddad mention them. Used to be good folks out there on the road, Cy said softly. Didn't matter what you looked like or drove, if you had your hazards on, someone pulled over. Kyle scribbled something, paused, then looked up. So, why'd you stop? He set the wrench down. Sometimes the road lets go before you're ready. He looked at the carving again. DB, and added, Pride's cheap kindness costs more, but it lasts longer. The light dipped lower, shadows lengthened across the floor. Kyle packed up and offered a brief thanks before heading off. The sound of his footsteps fading fast down the gravel stood still for a long moment, the quiet settling like dust. He reached for a small drawer near the back wall, opened it slowly, revealing an old rotary phone discolored but still plugged in. His hand hovered over it. He picked up the receiver, dialed from memory. The clicks echoed in the garage, loud in the stillness. It rang once, twice. From her laundry window across town, Mabel sees the lights of a big rig flicker faintly on the horizon. Millstone Gap had heard storms, sirens, and train whistles, but never the synchronized growl of 12 trucks rolling up Main Street. It began as a low hum, distant and vague like thunder dragging its heels across the hills. At first, no one paid it much mind. The Tuesday crowd had started to gather outside the courthouse, retirees, sipping coffee, in paper cups, a few farmers in ball caps leaning on their pickups, and Kyle sitting on the steps with his notebook, again scribbling, without real focus. Some muttered about that poor old man. Others just stared toward the horizon, waiting for the show to begin. Then the sound grew louder. Layered engines rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. One of the cafe waitresses stepped out. Apron still on, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Even Pete from the hardware store shaded his eyes under the brim of his hat and squinted down the road. They came in 2 by 2, like a funeral procession, rewritten in chrome and thunder. 12 rigs, each gleaming in the morning sun, engines harmonizing like some strange mechanical choir. They rumbled into town with reverence, not aggression. The lead truck, a deep navy Peterbilt with a silver eagle etched across its grille, rolled to a stop in front of the courthouse, followed by the others, forming a perfect semicircle. Along Main Street, C. Booker stood on the courthouse steps, his hands at his sides. Still, his eyes didn't widen. They softened. The first man to step down wore a scuffed leather vest over a denim jacket. Salt and pepper beard curling under his chin. He walked like someone who didn't need to prove anything. He tipped his cap toward Cy without a word and nodded once, deep and slow. Trent Smoke Holloway didn't speak until he'd climbed the last step and stood beside the older man. Said. That was all. Kyle looked up from his notebook. Blinking fast, he leaned toward Deputy Jenkins, whispering. Who are they? Jenkins shrugged, but his jaw had gone tight. Across the street, Randy Bloom exited the cafe with a to-go cup and stopped short, the plastic lid trembling in his fingers. Judge Grayson stepped through the courthouse door just as the last truck engine fell silent. She scanned the street, her posture unsure. The judge's robe suddenly feeling too thin for the morning air. What's going on here? She asked, voice firm but not harsh. Smoke stepped forward. We're not lawyers, ma'am, he said, his voice gravel soft but carrying. Just witnesses of a man who never asked for thanks. A murmur ran through the crowd, spreading like ripples on a pond. Someone up front whispered, that's Booker. Smoke reached into a canvas satchel slung across his chest and produced a photo in a weathered plastic sleeve. He didn't pass it to Randy, he handed it straight to Judge Grayson. It was a photo of a younger Cy Hare, still mostly dark shirt, soaked through, crouching in floodwater beside an open rig. Behind him another man held a stretcher. Oxygen tanks were strapped to the trailer's side. The date scrawled in red ink, May 1998. I was there, Smoke said, quieter now. He drove 18 hours through a closed interstate to get that oxygen where it needed to go. Carried the tanks himself when the water rose too fast. Judge Grayson took the photo carefully. Her fingers, usually steady, trembled slightly as she studied it. Behind her, Kyle stood so still he forgot to breathe. A small child broke the silence with a gasp, pointing to one of the trucker's vests. Mama, look, it says Road Angel Est, 1995. Randy tried to speak, but his mouth moved without sound. His smirk, earlier so effortless, had evaporated. Mabel, standing near the back of the crowd, with arms crossed and lips pursed, leaned toward the woman beside her and whispered just loud enough for the wind to catch it. Told y'all, he wasn't done mattering yet. Grayson set the photo down with trembling fingers. Mr. Booker, why didn't you mention this? Trent Smoke Holloway didn't carry a briefcase, just a coffee-stained patch jacket and a memory the law had long forgotten. The courtroom was different now. The benches, once half-empty and indifferent, were filled to the edges with faces that hadn't been inside since jury duty in '03. The ceiling fans spun with a lazy determination, stirring warm air that smelled faintly of pine floor cleaner and nerves. Outside the tall windows, townsfolk crowded the courthouse steps, balancing coffees in gloved hands, squinting past the fog of their own breath against the glass. Judge Grayson sat straighter than usual, fingers clasped together, just beneath her chin. The photo Smoke had presented still rested on her desk, but her eyes were fixed not on the image sigh in chest-deep floodwater, but on the man who'd brought it. Smoke stepped forward, his boots tapping a slow rhythm on the tile. He didn't glance at Randy. He didn't need to, ma'am, he said, voice rough but even. That flood in '98, it knocked out half the eastern routes. No one could get through. Dispatch tried airlifting the insulin, but the choppers got grounded. I was stuck in Nashville looking at a mother's face through a hospital window as her kids' sugar levels spiked. Cy Booker showed up. He paused, pulling something from his jacket pocket, a folded map, the creases worn soft. Drove 32 hours straight, no sleep, fuel stations closed, bridges closed, roads iced. He still made it. The courtroom was quiet, except for the creak of an old pew as someone shifted. In the back row, Mabel held a crumpled tissue in both hands. Her lips moved in silent agreement. One of the old veterans beside her gave a slow nod, the brim of his VFW cap trembling slightly. Smoke stepped aside. Marcy, he said without turning. Tell it your way. From the aisle, a woman in her late 40s rose. She wore flannel under a leather vest, her salt and pepper braid falling down her back like a statement. Not a style, she climbed the few steps to the stand, with the resolve of someone used to climbing tougher things. I was snowbound in Idaho, she began, eyes sweeping the crowd without flinching. Middle of nowhere rig, blown sideways in a ditch. It was 23 below, cell signal dead. I figured I'd see daylight, once, maybe twice more. She looked at Cy, then back to the room Cy found me. Don't ask how GPS was a prayer in those days. He hauled out my back axle with bungee cords and duct tape. Stayed up 2 nights patching it together so I could limp it to Missoula. Never asked for thanks, didn't even wait around to see if it held Randy. Shifted in his seat, his heel tapped involuntarily against the floor, a steady tick of discomfort. When Marcy sat back down, he stood abruptly. Your Honor, he began, trying for calm and missing it by inches. With all due respect, none of this, however heartwarming, proves legal ownership of the property in question. It's anecdotal, sentimental. Judge Grayson's gaze moved to him, sharp as glass, but cool. Mr. Bloom, she said, we are all aware of the legal definitions of ownership. But this court is also tasked with understanding the character and credibility of those who come before it. And in this case, character is not sentimental, it's substantial. Kyle, tucked near the back with his ever-present notebook, looked up sharply. His pen hovered above the page. In his lap, a folded brochure for a local civics competition trembled slightly as his fingers flexed. Next to him, a man in a faded marine jacket leaned closer and said quietly, "Sometimes, son, the ones who don't talk are the ones who did the most." At the bench, Judge Grayson opened the folder Smoke had placed beside the photograph. Her hands, usually precise and practiced, hesitated for just a breath. Inside, she found a brittle page from the Millstone Sentinel dated May 1998. The headline read, "Local trucker hailed a hero during storm." She read it silently, lips tightening. The article detailed a man driving through shut-down highways, ferrying emergency medical supplies, assisting stranded travelers, refusing interviews. The grainy picture showed a soaked figure with a Red Rock Freight logo on his sleeve, half turned from the camera. She folded the paper, the corners crackling like old leaves. Then she looked up, her voice quieter than the room had expected. "Mr. Booker, why have you never claimed any of this?" The past didn't knock, it barged into the courtroom with the muddy boots of memory. The light had shifted, it was still morning, but the day felt older now. Outside, clouds gathered over the courthouse like they were leaning in to listen. Inside, the blinds filtered sunlight into long, honey-colored stripes that sliced across the floor and benches. The scent of old paper and engine oil lingered faintly. Though no one could see why, Cy Booker sat in the witness chair, not slouched, but not upright either. Just there, as though the room, the noise, even the silence had finally worn smooth the sharp edges of his spine. He folded his hands in his lap, thick fingers stained with decades of grit. And when he finally spoke, it was in a voice shaped by gravel roads and too many miles alone. The flood hit. Sudden, he said, middle of May '98. Back then, I still had a rig with a dry box big enough to fit 2 pallets of medical-grade tanks. Dispatch said they'd tried helicopters, but wind had other plans. He cleared his throat and went on slowly, deliberately. By the time I hit Route 19, the water was already coming over the shoulder. I strapped the tanks down with 3-inch nylon and drove slow. Didn't stop, not even when the wipers gave out. Someone in the gallery coughed softly, but no one moved otherwise. Even the ceiling fan above seemed to have fallen into respectful stillness. I remember headlights reflecting off the floodwater. The road vanished, had to guess where pavement used to be. He paused, his gaze drifting toward the front pew, where Kyle sat, no longer taking notes. Just watching, I didn't think I was doing anything special. Cy continued, felt like, if I kept going, maybe the quiet wouldn't catch up, my boy Danny. He passed 3 months later. A valve thing in his heart hadn't even turned 30. His voice didn't break, it just faded. The room seemed to inhale around him. Helping folks, he said, felt like the only way to keep breathing. Judge Grayson had not moved from the bench, but something in her expression had begun to shift. She leaned forward, elbows resting gently on the worn wood. Her hand hovered near the tire keychain still resting beside the file folder, and her voice, when it came, was quieter than before. "There was a man," she said. "Back in '72, I was 5, floodwaters tore through Hollow Creek. I got stuck in the attic of the old post office. Mom had been swept out, but I don't remember the fear. Just the arms that lifted me through the attic hatch, carried me through waist-deep water." The courtroom held its breath. "He wore a Red Rock Freight cap," she added, as if she'd only just remembered it in full. "And he never gave me his name." Cy smiled gently, a slow tug at the corners of his mouth. "They gave out a lot of those caps, behind them." Smoke rose quietly and stepped toward the bench. He didn't say a word, just placed the small brass keychain beside the judge's gavel. Its charm, shaped like an old truck tire, twirled faintly before settling flat against the wood. Grayson reached for it, her fingers brushing the edges as if confirming it was real. She held it for a long moment before setting it down again with reverence. Sometimes, she said, proof is flesh and bone, not ink and seal. Nobody clapped, nobody dared. From the back of the courtroom, the wooden door eased open with a soft creak. A gust of cool air slipped in. Across the street, a white news van pulled up at the curb. The driver didn't step out, didn't ask for anyone's name. He simply opened the side panel, retrieved a tripod, and began setting up, drawn, perhaps not by a verdict, but by the sound of silence louder than applause. When the gavel dropped, it didn't sound like victory. It sounded like memory finally being honored. The room didn't erupt. There was no cheer, no dramatic gasp, just a stillness so complete. It felt holy. Sunlight slanted through the high windows, casting golden bars across the worn floorboards and warming the grain of the judge's bench. Outside, the trucks still lined Main Street, chrome glinting like metals, not pinned but earned. Judge Grayson's voice was steady but not cold. Mr. Silas Booker's land remains, his uninterrupted and uncontested. She paused, glancing toward the dozen truckers who stood at quiet attention along the courtroom walls. Furthermore, this court recommends a motion for historical recognition of Mr. Booker's service to Millstone County and the wider transport relief network during national emergencies. A few murmurs fluttered through the room, subdued, respectful. Kyle glanced sideways and saw Deputy Jenkins nod once, almost imperceptibly. It was the kind of gesture that men like him rarely gave and never for show. At the plaintiff's table, Randy Bloom gathered his papers wordlessly. The hinges of his briefcase groaned as he shut it, though it seemed to hold far less than it had when he'd strutted in. He didn't look at Cy as he exited, just kept his gaze down and his steps even. The courthouse door thudded closed behind him, with a finality that no gavel could match. Cy didn't smile. He only nodded once, then slowly stood. Moke clapped a calloused hand on his shoulder as they walked down the steps into the autumn light. By dusk, Booker's Hollow had changed. It started with folding tables dragged out from church basements and garage corners. Mabel brought her good gingham tablecloth, even if it had a wine stain from the 2011 Christmas potluck. Smoke hauled in 2 coolers of sweet tea, and someone from the volunteer firehouse showed up with a tray of cornbread still warm from the oven. The smell of diesel mixed with barbecue and fiddles that knew songs older than anyone there. Children zigzagged between the rigs, their fingers trailing along dusty decals and faded patches, like they were relics from a time their textbooks had forgotten. One boy in cowboy boots whispered, "They're like knights," before peeking reverently inside a cab. Kyle sat on the garage steps beside Cy, a laptop perched on his knees. "Took me all night," he said, offering a small flash drive. "All your logs, every handwritten note, photo invoice. It's all digitized now. Your story won't fade again." Cy took the flash drive in both hands. Didn't speak, just held it like a fragile thing. Inside the courthouse, long after the hearing had ended, Judge Grayson stood before a glass memorial case in the entry hall. She placed Cy's faded laminated ID beside a neatly folded flag and an old firefighter's helmet. The light caught the scratched plastic in a way that made it seem new again. Behind her, the halls echoed with quiet. Back at the garage, someone placed a pie on the table, uneven crust. "Thank you." Mr. Booker etched in shaky frosting. It was too sweet, and Cy chuckled when he took a bite, but he finished the slice anyway. As the stars blinked on above the hills, the trucks began to roll out. One by one, they peeled off the gravel like parts of a symphony, easing into silence. Headlights flicked across the trees, then vanished down the road. Cy stood by the doorway, watching. His hand reached up and brushed the beam where Danny's initials had been carved. Be still there after all these years. Then slowly, he reached inside and flicked off the porch light, not in sadness but peace. He never asked for thanks, and that's why they showed up. The trucks are gone now, but something in Millstone Gap feels quietly rearranged, like the town remembered something it didn't know it had forgotten. A man once mocked for a worn ID is now stitched into the memory of a place that nearly let him vanish. Sometimes the truest legacy doesn't live in titles or deeds, but in lives touched and burdens shared without fanfare or demand. Kindness, when offered freely, has a way of circling back like headlights in the dark, coming up the road just when you think you're alone. Maybe next time we meet someone whose story doesn't show on the surface, we'll pause before assuming we know the whole map. After all, the quietest people often drive the farthest roads.